Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome you to the second version of the Dean's Election Conversation Series. Thank you for coming today. I'm Paul Wahlbeck, Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm thrilled to have you here. When I think of the Columbian College, I think of the engaged liberal arts. And one way that the engaged liberal arts is made manifest is in a session like this, where we take faculty expertise and apply them to the grand challenges or the big issues facing the nation and the world. So no better place than to talk about the election and the major issues that we're discussing as part of the run-up to the presidential election in November. So today we're going to be talking about the economy. There are a handful of issues that are always a major topic in any election season, and the economy is it. So today we have three experts on economic issues, the economy, public policy, and I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists to discuss these major topics. So let me get started by introducing our panelists. Sarah Binder is a professor of political science whose research work focuses on the politics of legislative institutions, including their origins, development, and the impact on policy outcomes. Tara Sinclair is a professor of economics and international affairs and director of the GW Center for Economic Research, which focuses on modeling and forecasting macroeconomic fluctuations and trends. And finally, Kate Yang is an associate professor of public policy and public administration whose research examines how state governments address local government finances and fiscal stress. So welcome and thank you for participating today. I should note for all of you that we're being live streamed, so later on there'll be time for questions and your questions are being live streamed. So let's get started with a basic question. What's going on with the U.S. economy and with U.S. economic policy? Tara, can we start with you? Some basic discussion of the current trajectory of the economy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul, so much for inviting me here. I turned it on. Testing. There, I just have to hold it really close to my mouth. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and couldn't agree more with this engaged liberal arts and the importance of really discussing these topics here and only at GW. And so when we think about the economic context that we're in right now, really the first thing we have to go back to is the pandemic, because that's still really dominating a lot of the economic conversation and context that we're in now. And if we look at the U.S. economic performance, particularly as compared to other advanced economies, really what we've seen is the U.S. has really blown everybody else out of the water. The U.S. economy has just had a remarkable recovery from all the economic shocks from the pandemic. And so I think that's really important context, because sometimes we look at our own experience. We don't necessarily see what's going on around the world. But we all experienced these economic shocks, both the pandemic and then also Russia's war in Ukraine, coming in and affecting everybody's economy. Everybody saw a big economic decline and then saw inflation thereafter. But now when we look at where the U.S. economy is today, we're continuing to see strong economic growth along with cooling inflation and low unemployment. And so that's really the context that we're looking at now. And let me just highlight quickly three things that I want to point out. First of all, it is remarkable to see where our economy is today with the fight that the Fed put in against inflation. So if we think about that, we started from zero interest rates in 2022. They raised interest rates above 5%, and that brought inflation has really cooled off and come back really near their target. And yet the unemployment rate still remains right at about what they think to be the long run unemployment rate. And so that's really remarkable on that front. And then if we think about on the federal budget side, it takes money to fight a pandemic. And so we did see a huge increase in federal debt. What's concerning is that looking forward, there's still forecasts for continued deficits, and that's something that I think both parties are being asked to address and aren't really addressing. And then finally, the other economic piece of context that I think we need to kick this off is to think about how much people hate inflation. I mean, that's really a key thing that we learned here in this economic environment, is that people really hate inflation. And people want to see prices come down. But we really need to remember that bringing aggregate prices down comes at a huge economic cost that we really wouldn't want. Because if we see prices come down in the future, if we're expecting those prices to come down, then we're going to cut back on spending today. If it cuts back on spending today, then other people will lose their jobs because people won't be buying their goods and services that they're producing. And that's going to go on and cause really economic weakness. And so I think we really want to focus on are the economic strengths that we're seeing currently.
Any other panelists want to chime in on this one? That cover it?
I always defer to Tara.
Oh, nice. All right. So Sarah, let me ask you a question then. Thinking about inflation, I think about the Federal Reserve and the important role that the Fed plays in setting interest rates. So let's talk about the role of monetary policy and the power of the Federal Reserve. That certainly is at the forefront of the campaign. So where do the candidates stand with regard to the Fed's independence?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to CCAS and everyone for coming. So I think first and foremost to keep in mind that the two campaigns here, both Trump and Vice President Harris, have quite a stark different view about their role and the Fed's role. I think Harris falls along what we sort of conceptually think of as the norm, although in a moment we'll come back to realize the norm isn't very long-standing. But the notion that presidents really do not want to and do not put their fingerprints and pressure the Fed for typically lower rates. That there's a notion, at least amongst economists, who will say that the more independent the Fed, the lower is inflation. And lots of debates about why and how and whether that is and how long that's been there. But the notion here is that the Fed will make better policy and will be more willing to take tough votes on interest rates if they're not being pushed constantly for lowering and juicing the economy before an election. And especially before an election, we might not want presidents weighing in, because if the Fed officials were to bend to that pressure, keep interest rates too low for too long, the future several months later, a year later, will be felt in the economy with higher inflation. As Tara said, nobody likes, we're all now reminded, nobody likes inflation. Also keep in mind, you can imagine where the president keeps pushing the Fed for low and lower rates, and the Fed, to demonstrate its independence, actually raises rates or is more hawkish in their behavior to demonstrate their independence. And that's probably worse for the economy and for everybody as well. But Harris seems to abide by this notion that presidents are going to keep their hands off the Fed. Now, Biden before her occasionally would let slip, although to his credit, when it was clear that the Fed was behind the ball in raising rates, as Tara said, once they got along with the system, even Biden said when he appointed Powell, the Fed's going to take care of this. They're actually going to be raising rates to deal with inflation. He said that in a roundabout way, but a symbol that there's political support for doing that tough thing. By and large, Biden was pretty quiet, by and large, not entirely, and then Harris has said, I totally abide by that. Trump, as we know, is a norm breaker, and it was the same for Fed independence. He was tweeting, he was attacking, he compared right in the middle of the biggest Fed conference of the year, he had attacked Chairman Powell, saying he was basically worse than President Xi, Premier Xi of China, which I don't know if they were chuckles or concerns at Jackson Hole that year, but that was relentless. pointless. We can debate later whether or not it mattered to the Fed. There's some evidence that it might have mattered. It might have led them to change their mind a little bit on rates, or markets to react to what they might do. But Trump has certainly suggested, and he suggested it even today, that he wants an even greater role, not just needling the Fed or pointing a tweet at them, but having a say on what interest rates should be. And so there's no reason a double negative is about to hop out of my head. There's no reason we shouldn't. We should totally expect Trump, if elected and returned to the White House, he'd be even more aggressive. One of his advisors a week or two ago suggested that Trump appoint a shadow Fed chair and push, even though there's no vacancy in the Fed chair until May 2026, to basically push, presumably a Republican Senate, to confirm the shadow Fed chair and just let the shadow Fed chair pretend to be chair, which would just be chaos in the markets and probably not good for the Trump economy. But there's no reason to think that anything really would be different a second time around.
Thank you. So one of the topics that we've already touched on is the deficit. I've seen news stories about campaigns' comments on the deficit recently. So is the federal deficit an issue at all in this presidential election? Kate?
Thank you for having me, Dean Wahlbeck, and thank you for asking that question. Not too many people care about the federal deficit. At least that's not the first issue that jumped to their mind when we think about presidential election. I did see a New York Times kind of headline piece about the federal deficit and debt, because the federal debt has crossed a kind of a landmark level. Now it's larger than, or it's soon to be larger than annual GDP, so the size of the U.S. economy. And the last time the federal debt was so large was 1946, so right after the war. At the time, it was considered to be justified, right? We were after a war, the nation needed to rebuild, and it's justified that the federal government can take out a large debt. But right now, we're not in a war. Actually, our economy is doing really well, but in the past 7 decades, the federal government has been running consistently a deficit, and in order to pay for that deficit, issuing more and more debt. So we have a large amount of debt, the federal government does. Second, sometimes people mention the annual interest payment. I think that's an interesting statistic to look at, maybe not necessarily the best one or the most concerning one, but the federal government right now is paying over, I believe, $600 billion in interest payments on those federal debt. So that we pay interest on the debt, and then that also mature, we have to pay the principal back. That's a lot of money. And to put it into perspective, that's more than what we pay for defense. That's on par with Medicare, which is one of the largest federal programs. So the federal government has a lot of deficit annually and has accumulated a lot of debt overall. And I think there is a growing consensus right now. That's an issue. It's not, a few years back, if you still remember, that was before the pandemic, there is the modern monetary theory, kind of a group of economists and policymakers who have jumped onto this notion that it's not an issue, right? We've always had a lot of federal debt, and we've never had problem with them. There seems to be no lack of interested investors in those debt. I think that has kind of faded away somewhat due to the recent inflation, but it is still, there's consensus that that is an issue, but there is now no political willingness to really tackle the debt. And the reason why I say that, since we're talking about the presidential election, is that both candidates have come out with policy proposals that would increase the debt. Right, two different degrees. We don't have all the specifics, but some think tank, nonpartisan think tank has issued estimates. Both candidates will increase deficit and debt, and Trump's proposal so far seem to be having an even larger impact, meaning it will increase deficit more than Harris' proposal. And if I have time, one example I would give would be the tax cut expiration. So tax cuts, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 decreased individual taxes through both structural changes such as capping certain exemptions and deductions, but also through lowering rates. And that will expire soon. And both candidates have announced support for at least continuing some of the tax cuts, with Trump being more aggressive as saying not only would he make the individual tax cuts continue, but he would also further reduce the corporate income tax, which is also cut during by the 2017 Act, but it's a permanent portion of the act. But candidate Harris also said that she would keep the tax cuts for those making, I believe, less than $400,000 household-wise, I believe. So both will add to deficit. And we see candidates feeling really passionate about policy proposals, but not many people are paying attention to deficit and debt. I personally believe it's a big issue, but it's a very hard issue to tackle. It requires really a norm change, requires all of you perhaps to pay a little bit more attention to the deficit and debt issue, requires policymakers to pay a little bit more attention to CBO, Congressional Budget Office cost estimate when new legislations are proposed. I do not have a good answer to what the solution will be, but I do want to just make the point that I think it's an important issue that the country has to tackle in the future, in both the short term and the long term.
Sorry, just to add on to that, I completely agree with everything that you said, and also wanted to highlight that because of the revenue cuts from the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that really does set the U.S. out of the norm of what other advanced economies are looking at in terms of taxes paid. And so this is, again, talking about what do we have to do as taxpayers if we want to continue to receive the benefits and services that we're receiving from the government, and if we want them to offer us more things, we do have to find a way to pay for that. And it probably does come in some form of higher taxes, because it's not going to be a simple cutting of casual discretionary spending that's going to get us to basically a sustainable debt plan. It's likely going to involve some major reforms of some of the mandatory spending that we're looking at, and probably some revenue raisers as well.
So another topic that we've already touched on here is inflation. One piece that makes inflation so painful to people in the population is the cost of is the housing cost, and the ability of especially young people to find affordable housing. So how are the candidates' economic proposals addressing these issues? Kate?
Yeah, I can get us started on that one. I do think we have two issues here. One is inflation, the inflation rate that we have talked about. One is affordability. I think there are affordability issues or crises that have been really brewing before even inflation has become an issue. So even before the pandemic, I recall there were discussions about how a lot of things have become really expensive, including housing, but also like childcare, which I pay on a monthly basis, so it's really real. Education, higher ed, healthcare, maybe elder care as well, right? Those are the areas that people really feel they don't perhaps feel it on a daily basis. It's not like going to the grocery store and paying, the bill and realize, oh, the eggs have become really expensive, but they occupy those consumption items occupy a large portion of our expenditure overall. So I think there's affordability issue, and then there's the inflation issue. I think affordability issue really predates all the inflation discussions that we recently have focused on. And perhaps the inflation has made it really real, right? Now I'm reminded when I pay for the egg that, oh, my childcare is also getting more expensive. And you know what? We're talking about thousands of dollars of increases as opposed to, $2 a box of increases. So housing is a big one, as you mentioned. I think both candidates have come out with some policy proposals to address housing issue, and I think there are more specifics provided by Harris than Trump. For example, she has set the target of adding 3 million, I think, new housing units. How to get that? She has proposed first-time home buyer credits, for example, that's a tax credits that will be given to first-time home buyers. She has also proposed tax credits that are targeted at developers as opposed to buyers. I think mostly tax credits for developers to develop affordable housing units or low-income housing tax credits. There are also proposals to lower regulatory burdens, making, for instance, environmental review for building new housing less of a burden. I think that's an area Trump also has similar proposals. But again, on the Trump side, I have not saying very specific policy proposals as I have on the Harris side. At the end, I'm skeptical personally about how those proposals will lead to necessarily lower housing prices, let alone, the very specific target that Harris has set, 3 million new housing units. I think part of the issue is that housing shortage or housing kind of affordability is not completely within the control of the federal government. Oftentimes, it is a local issue, right? Because we know that we have a very big country with a lot of space to build, but people don't always want to live in certain areas. And most of the time, people want to live in a very small area that everyone else wants to live in. And that makes housing affordability really an issue. And we also have local zoning regulations that making kind of dense development in those desirable areas really hard to happen. So I think the federal government can do certain things, and there are definitely policies that have shown to be ineffective oftentimes, but also others that have been shown to be effective that could be enacted on the federal level. But a lot of state and local governments really need to act in order to kind of resolve this housing affordability issue.
So let me turn to another hot topic, especially on a college campus, and that is student loan forgiveness. So the Biden-Harris administration pushed forward a student loan forgiveness proposal. Has Trump come forward with a plan to address that issue, and what impact would student loan forgiveness have on the economy? Tara?
Sure. So as an economist, I'm going to focus on the economic impact side of things. I haven't seen a particular proposal from Trump on this issue. As we know, sometimes it's a challenge because we don't have like a clear policy statement from him on many issues, including this one. But on the economic impact side of these things, this is a challenging one because obviously. Recent alums, current students really like the idea of loan forgiveness. That sounds great. I would love that too. But we really have to think carefully about how it's implemented, both to see if even students today would benefit from it, or if it would only be people who took out loans before the loan forgiveness policies came into being, or is it the sort of policy that's going to stimulate further educational demand that might have benefits to our economy to get more people in education, but that's really different from the student loan forgiveness plans that have been circulated recently, which is mostly about a wealth transfer, about taking people who took out loans for college and then having the government give them money for those loans. And that's a really complicated issue to get right, because as economists, we want to think about what's the market failure here that the government is trying to address, and what is the type of impact that we're wanting to have this policy. Is it simply we want to make people who have student loans happy? Or is it that we think that that's an effective way to transfer wealth in our economy, to reward people who took out student loans in the past? And so broadly, when think tanks have analyzed the specific proposals that have come out, and of course we've seen a flow of different ones as legal challenges have arisen, But for each one, there's definitely the question of what's the aggregate economic impact. And overall, it looks to be small because on the one hand, it's going to have some negative impacts to the government budget. But on the other hand, it will transfer some wealth into hands where people might go out and spend that, and that could stimulate the economy under certain conditions, and could somewhat address certain forms of inequality, but it might not be the best policy or well targeted, and may not serve the people who are lobbying for it. Particularly, it might be better to have more grants rather than loan forgiveness.
So, what's the impact? This is an interesting variant on a question. So what's the impact of partisanship on voters' economic views? And do voters love the policies that economists love to hate? Tara?
Yeah, so this is a really fun one because, if we think about the policies that economists love to hate, there does seem to be this communication disconnect. And so this is something that I hope we can somewhat address a little bit tonight, is that economists were trying to think about actually achieving the goals that voters want. Oftentimes when we hear policy proposals, they sound nice and shiny on the surface, but then if they're actually implemented, we've seen through past experience with those same policies or policies like that they don't get people what people think they're being promised. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with a lot of these policies. So I'll take one, for example, that I think is a kind of a bipartisan one. So the no tax on tips. So that's an area where both parties have talked about some version of that. And at first it sounds really nice. It's like, oh, great, tipped workers, they're lower income. This is a way to reduce their tax burden. That sounds great. And then economists get in there and we say, oh, but we know how people behave. We know that they're going to go in and, I'm going to ask Dean Wahlbeck, like, hey, how about maybe part of my salary becomes a tip? We're all going to want that, right? And and you can immediately imagine Wall Street people who get a lot of their compensation in bonuses. What's a bonus? It's a tip, right? And so I think we have to think really carefully, and this goes down the line. There was this great Wall Street Journal article that did go through a survey of economists on a number of policies and really showed the huge range between where economists are on these policies, for tariffs, for example, and other policies of that sort, blaming the corporations for corporate greed. We can go back and forth, and it's great for people in government to both take too much credit for the good things in the economy and cast off too much blame to others for the bad things in the economy. And I think we're really playing that at the extreme in this particular election, where we're seeing that Trump and on his party is really pushing on blaming foreigners and immigrants for a lot of challenges in the U.S. economy. And then on the Democrat side, we're looking at pushing a lot of responsibility on corporations. And is it true that the presidential candidates actually have that much control in either case? I don't think so. But it's also the case that casting the blame on these particular other groups won't necessarily solve the problems either. The economy is an incredibly complex system, and there isn't a simple, easy answer where we can just blame one group and make them fix it.
If I may add to that, I teach tax policy, and that's a good area to find examples of policies where voters like and economists dislike. Examples would include Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There were structural changes that I mentioned earlier, like getting rid of personal exemption, capping state and local tax deduction, capping mortgage interest deduction. You may have, or your family, people may have benefited from those before, and all of of a sudden, standard deduction is raised, that's the only thing they can take. Over 90% of taxpayers take standardized deduction as opposed to itemized deduction. They can no longer itemize. They feel, the opportunity to lower tax liability has been taken away from them. But that simplification really matters. It made the tax system more simple, but it's also more efficient, right? But at the same time, it's a hard sell. Like when we talk about, we're gonna get rid of those caps, people like them. And I think actually both candidates have expressed the interest in kind of getting rid of those caps, which are, in my opinion, the good portion, the good features of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So those are other examples. But I do think this type of conversation matters because it's more about kind of the discourse, right? What are we trying to show and trying to have a healthy debate about the pros and cons of those policies and trying to show, perhaps there is more to it. Perhaps tariffs can really increase prices. Perhaps that's going to hurt everybody. So they're not as exciting as we might think. And they're perhaps not going to add lots of good paying jobs as we think they might. So having that conversation, getting those debates out there, I think is really, really important.
Well, a presidential election is a national event, and yet a lot of things that take place in the economy are local. So how, Kate, how have state and local governments fared in recent years when it comes to economic growth?
Thank you for asking that, and that's truly the area of my interest. And when pandemic first hit, I don't know if you remember, there were a lot of discussions about state and local governments needing assistance from the federal government. I think that's a kind of a nightmare or a bad dream from the Great Recession, when the federal government did not act really on time or to the extent they perhaps could have, giving out a lot of assistance to state and local governments, and state and local governments kind of were left to fight or handle some of the problem on their own. And so very quickly, we saw money coming from the federal government being transferred to state and local government. Part of it is done, most of it done through the American Rescue Plan Act. So state and local government got a lot of money. And at the same time, kind of another good thing that happened to them, financially speaking, is that they realized their tax revenue wasn't hurt as much as they thought they would. What happened was that people also got money, individuals got money, checks from the federal government, and they started buying a lot of stuff. And they started buying a lot of stuff at home. So they were paying essentially sales taxes to the local jurisdictions they live in. And the state and local governments that collect sales taxes got a lot of money. So their sales tax revenue actually wasn't negatively impacted at all. So combining both tax revenue and federal transfers, state and local fiscal conditions were very good during and following the pandemic. That's not to say everything was great, right? We've seen some areas, kind of challenging areas, education being one. We know a lot of kids were not able to go to school or had to attend virtual school, and that wasn't highly productive. So we have kids that are left behind, test scores have not caught up. So a lot of education investment has to happen, and the federal government again has spent a lot of money, but it does not seem to be sufficient so far, at least kind of what we have observed in terms of test scores. Another area is that a lot of states cut back taxes. So now they have this problem, federal transfers have dried out, but they've already made tax cuts. How do they sustain their pandemic level of spending, right? They don't have sufficient revenue to pay for those things. So they are faced with the question of, should they raise the tax this time again, or should they just cut back spending? So those are the issues that the state and local governments are dealing with. But overall, I would say state and local governments are doing great, which candidates don't talk about when it comes to presidential election. But I want to say, state and local governments are really important. When federal government spends a lot of money, those programs have to be implemented by state and local governments. We've spent a lot of money through Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill. All of those programs, many of those programs have to be implemented by state and local governments. So having highly capable and financially sound state and local governments is essential to fulfilling the federal policy objectives because lots of money are transferred, again, from the federal government to the state and local governments and being implemented by state and local governments.
Well, as James Carville once said during President Clinton's first run for the White House, it's the economy, stupid. Is that still the case, Sarah, when it comes to how people vote?
Well, one member of my family, who shall go nameless, watches a lot of MSNBC, and so I hear distantly in the house, Carville is still at it. He's still, you can still listen to him, and there's a documentary coming out about him, I've heard as well. However, this notion that people's vote choice is conditioned and really shaped by their perceptions of the economy, not by their own sort of pocketbook, as we call it, but of national conditions. That's sort of a very long-standing relationship that political scientists and economists have sort of built into their models of presidential elections. So on the one hand, there's it wasn't unique to Carville, but of course he put it quite pithily, as it were. So what is that view? It's essentially that what we call it the referendum theory, that elections provide a chance for voters to hold accountable the incumbent's presidential party. So in this case, the Democrats, even though it's not Biden running, it's Harris running. Essentially, voters will punish or reward the incumbent party for its performance in office. And as we sort of hinted, some of these economic changes and developments and outcomes are not always in the hands of the grasp or the impact of politicians, or certainly we might hold them accountable for fiscal policy. Maybe we shouldn't hold them accountable for monetary policy. But by and large, voters would just use the election, according to the theory, as reward or punish. So I think if you looked at the state of the economy today, and I would defer to Tara on which indicators to choose, but as Tara mentioned, inflation is sort of back to the Fed's target. Real GDP, I mean, GDP is doing pretty well. Real, I guess, household income took a very large hit with inflation, but it seems real wages seem to be sort of back on track. And if you take those sort of indicators on a little graph and you compare it to presidential outcomes, I would say the Harris numbers, they put her just like a very bare win, at least, as you know, popular vote, but doesn't give you the presidency. But having said that, evaluations of presidents today are far more often anchored in people's partisanship, not in what they look out and see as the state of the economy. In fact, people's views about the parties, or rather about our presidential candidates and so forth, they're far less sensitive to changes in economic conditions. So if you compared the state of the economy to how people are feeling about the economy, as the economy got better, and we asked them, what do you think about the president? Well, presidential approval would rise with better economic conditions. But starting about Obama through Trump and a little bit of Biden, that relationship's kind of flattened out, right? You don't get those incremental feeling better about the president as the economy improves. So, and we see that lots of indicators. University of Michigan has a consumer confidence indicator. How are you feeling? Is this a good time to buy goods and services, and all sorts of other types of questions like that. But basically, how confident are you in the state of the economy? And if you look 2016, right before the presidential election, when many people expected Hillary Clinton to win, Republicans answered that question. Their answers were really low, like really down on the economy. And Democrats were riding high, and they had really high expectations. And the first time after the election that the next Michigan questionnaire came out, the survey came out, and Republicans are like, this is great economy. You know, Trump was just barely in office, and Democrats were, I'm surprised they answered the phone. I mean, Democrats' views of the economy were just in the tank. And of course, that switched not quite as robustly, but there was a switch again when Biden came into office. So what's going on here? That notion that it's not the economy driving your vote, but rather your views about the politicians and your partisanship driving the economy gives rise to a whole different theory of vote choice in elections, right? What we might call basically a partisan theory. Some people call it like a tribalism theory, but the notion that most voters have already chosen a team, right? Their social identities, their race, their ethnicity, whether they've been to college, right? All those types of demographics, plus their partisan affiliations, sort of lead you and dictate which team or candidate you're going to choose, right? Your choice of candidates not dependent on things that are changing in political outcomes. So if that's the case, then it's with all due respect to Mr. Carville, it's not the economy anymore. It's people's perceptions, and those happens to be your partisan loyalties. And just to see where that brings us today, right? The parties are essentially at parity. And so if almost everybody's chosen a team, it means there are very few of these swing voters. And as we know, there are very few states where there are very few swing voters that are up for grabs. And that means this election is really, if you're subscribed, right, to the referendum theory, the election is about persuading people. I gotta get the independents on my side. I need to track some of those, Haley Republicans. I need to pull some over to the Democratic side. But if you're in the partisan theory side, like, it's turnout, right? Find those voters. So in the end, with such sort of competitive elections, right, that just, campaigns, what are they doing? They're just reinforcing your partisanship. That's what the campaign's about. And of course, we've known that since the 40s and 50s when political scientists first started looking at it. But so I'd give maybe half a point to Carville, but I don't know.
Thank you. Well, thank you, panelists. Now let me turn to the audience. So, questions for our panelists?
Yes. I guess this might be more directed at Professor Sinclair since you talked about it a little bit earlier, but like we've said a bunch, inflation's at the Fed's kind of optimal rate for right now, but prices are still really high. I come from rural Pennsylvania and I have a lot of young male friends who are going to vote Trump very proudly November 5th. And one of their big reasons is they just keep seeing high prices in grocery stores, at clothing stores, everywhere they go. So with Trump's tax policies, cutting taxes for corporations, cutting some of the red tape, maybe this is a little out of the purview of this talk, but do you see decreases in prices at grocery stores for commodity items, for things like that over a span of 4 years? Or is this something J.D. Vance is going to be running on in 8, 12 years?
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot packed into that question. First of all, I normally think about the executive branch as not having a lot of influence on the aggregate price level. Now, it is true that Biden has put a lot of policies targeting particular salient goods that, and I think particularly on healthcare, there is definitely some room there to bring costs down there. But this broader idea that with a new president we might get lower prices, I think there is some potential for that under Trump, but I fear it's the very scary pattern of weakening economy, bringing prices down, but also reducing jobs and really reducing people's purchasing power kind of across the board. Instead, I think looking at, again, some of these same nonpartisan think tank reviews of some of his policy proposals, not only do those reviews seem to suggest that it's going to bring higher costs to the federal government overall, but also higher inflation overall. Because as Sarah pointed out, if he does start weighing in on the Fed, that's likely to get the Fed to ease off, or could potentially get the Fed to ease off. I still trust the Fed. I think they're still going to hold the line, but there's going to be a lot of pressure for them to ease off on their fight of inflation, and then potentially bring some further inflationary risks there. But I also think if you look at tariffs, that's another case where that's going to potentially bring higher prices across all the goods that are under tariff, because at the end of the day, what a tariff is pushing up the prices on the tariffed goods, and we're the ones that pay those prices. Well, there's lots more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Are you where are you registered to vote?
Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Okay, awesome, great.
All right. Interesting. Next question. Yes.
I have a question for Sarah. This idea of, and thank you, by the way, the panel is great. And I'm an economist, but I'm going to direct this to the political scientists there. This idea of tribes. When did we start talking about red and blue teams? Because I'm going to say that I lived in Europe for a while, and I said, how do you know which one is which? And they said, well, R is Republican. In England, the red ones are the socialists. So when did this start happening? Because it seems so powerful
So let's just repeat the question for the live stream audience. So when did this change in development in tribalism or partisanship take place?
So that's a great question. And keeping in mind, we have a pretty strong two-party system, and so we've been either blessed with or stuck with the Democratic and the Republican labels since mid-late 19th century. But my answer here is really in a shorter term, let's say last 40, 50 years. If we think about parties at mid-century or mid-20th century, you wouldn't have seen quite that level of what we now call tribalism. And that in part is because the parties were much more ideologically and demographically diverse. So compare Democrats then, you'd have across the South was solidly Democratic, but the South was also before the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, solidly Democratic, but also white conservatives were the ones largely with the power to vote. Blacks were we might say they technically could vote, but voting rights were squashed at the voting box. So if you were conservative in the South, there were no Republicans to vote. If you were conservative in the South, there were no Republicans to vote for. You voted for Democrats. But the Democratic Party was also a sort of prominent label and party in the North, which is where progressively liberals would vote for. So you had both conservatives and often at that time segregationists in the Democratic Party, as well as an emerging liberal end of the party in the North, and in California was actually California's Republican. Hold on. So same thing essentially for the Republicans, a party of the Northeast all the way to the West. And we would have what we called then liberal Republicans, right? We don't have the notion of a liberal Republican anymore. We barely have moderates. We have mostly conservatives, and now we have a new wing-ish of what we'll just call the MAGA wing. So in a period like that, you wouldn't have seen yourself in a common team with the guys in the South. So what happens in mid-century? First, you get the Voting Rights Act, you get the Civil Rights Act, you get the rebirth of the Republican Party in the South, so that if you are conservative, you're voting for Goldwater, you're voting for Nixon, and then you begin to get the choices to vote for Republican conservatives for Congress and for the Senate. So the parties change over this time. Other things are happening as well. We could do a longer discussions to figure out what else is driving this polarization of the parties, like where's the team play coming from. But essentially, all these sort of currents that divide Democrats and Republicans, everything's aligning up with them. If I tell you I'm Jewish, you'll say, oh, you're a Democrat. If I tell you I live in a city, you know I'm Democrat. If I live in a rural area, most likely I'm Republican. If I'm college educated, these days I'm increasingly likely to vote Democratic. In the suburbs, things are a little more mixed, but by and large, that's what people are talking about tribalism. Like all these identifiers, they're all lined up in the Democratic Party. And so it becomes very much my team's, your team's for it, my team's against it. Even on issues that aren't ideological, right? We see the parties take opposite sides. And presidents will say it. Obama would say, there's a big deficit reduction effort in 2010. He's like, I'm not signing on because the moment I touch it, the Republicans will recoil from it, even if it wasn't ideological. But hopefully that gives like a little sense of what might be driving this type of what people call sort of negative partisanship.
Yes.
Hey, thanks for all of this. So you guys were talking about some of the policies that both sides have put up in general terms about the economy, and none of them sounded very good. I feel like from what I heard, both sides are going to increase spending, the debt isn't really, it's going to increase, housing policy probably won't have the effect that we're anticipating it to have. Are there any policies that are currently in the conversation around the economy that you think would address some of these issues, or that are currently not in the conversation that should be?
All right, so the question is on the policy proposals by the campaigns. Are there any that would result in some positive change or positive movement? Or are there any that should be discussed that aren't currently being discussed?
The first one that came to my mind is the Medicare prescription drug negotiation. I think that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it was also a revenue raiser or a deficit reducer for the federal government. It also had, concrete benefits brought to the public, and I think both candidates have expressed interest in furthering kind of drug price negotiation, bringing down drug price. So I think that's one area I see potential. But a lot of the policy discussions we've had have to be caveated by saying it depends on the Congress. We're not just electing the president. It depends on how the Congress will look like, and whether there will be political consensus to enact laws. And I think there's still, I'm not a political scientist, I would not bet my money on my prediction, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. So yeah. It'll be interesting to see what will happen.
Great, I'll chime in as well. And so +1 on the role of Congress. I think we give a lot of agency to the executive branch when really, when it comes to these economic policies, they do have to get passed by Congress, and that adds a lot of additional challenges there. But I'll highlight a couple of policies that I think both sides have discussed, and so there does seem to be some bipartisanship, and they're both around housing. So the permitting reform that it seems like both sides seem to be quite keen on. Permitting reform, generally finding ways to reduce red tape around building of new housing. I think that's an area where we can see some improvements there. I mean, I don't know how we're going to get to 3 million new units, but I think that can be really, really helpful and can have some federal thumb on something that is broadly a local issue, as Kate mentioned. But then the other one, and this is a policy that Trump brought up in one of his previous economic speeches, but Biden had actually also previously brought it up, is around looking at federal land and seeing if there's building that can be done on federal land. And so I think that's an area that maybe we can get around some of the challenges of the classic not in my backyard, local regulations preventing building if we can build on the public land. And so there does seem to be some interest on both sides on that one too.
Two separate questions. One, what explains American exceptionalism in terms of pandemic recovery? And second, there wasn't much discussion at all about immigration, which is probably the biggest political issue right now. On immigration, sort of what's its impact historically on the economy, and what's going to happen if Trump gets in and the Army deports 10 million illegal aliens?
All right, so to repeat the questions, so what explains the American exceptionalism in the response or the recovery from the pandemic? And then the second question, sort of the bundling of all the issues around immigration and its economic impact.
So I have thoughts on both, but since I'm the one who brought up the American exceptionalism on the economic recovery, I'll start with that one. And so this is something that's going to take. This is going to create research topics for economists for years. But big caveat here. I worked at the Treasury for a couple of years in the middle of all of this, so I have a particular view. But I think there are two things we can point to. I think we did policy well. I do actually think that we did policy better than other countries did. But we also faced less of a shock from the Russia's war in Ukraine, which I think did really derail some economic recoveries in some of our G7 partner countries. But I think some of it was that we did policy well. I think, and some of it was just like luck of how our policy was structured, because everybody was just running and just doing whatever they had, already in the playbook. And I think some of it was luck on that front, but it worked out well for us. But then I will also point out that both the American consumer just keeps on driving, which is not something, the optimism in the American consumer really does seem to be contributing here. But then we've also had luck on productivity gains as well that other countries haven't seen. And I think that's really the big question mark going forward, is if we are able to get more goods and services out of the same workforce, how do we continue to grow that and continue to innovate along those lines? And can we also share that knowledge of how to do that with other countries? Because it'd be great if everyone were growing as strongly as the U.S. was. Does somebody else want to take the immigration one, Sarah?
I can take part of the immigration, less so the impact of immigration on the economy. In terms of the prospects that Congress or a new Congress would be able and willing to do some sort of grand immigration reform, first keep in mind the last time there was major immigration reform was 1986, which most of you were not. Okay, I don't need to finish that sentence. And we've seen most recently a little taste from the emergence of a bipartisan immigration plan in the Senate that Republicans advanced, and there were sufficient numbers, and Democrats were willing to go along with it, even though it was far more draconian on asylum and border security than what they were comfortable with. We're willing to do it in part to have to try to solve the problem and to have an issue to run on. And I think, keep in mind, Biden was still in the race then. I think he thought that this was good for the referendum theory to be rewarded for doing that. And as we know, there's a Trump intervention and that blew things up. So the question is, we don't know whether it's unified party control or not. Under Senate rules, you're going to need to do immigration, you need large bipartisan support to do it. It's not clear to me that Democrats would be willing to go along with the type of security provisions and asylum provisions they were willing to do when Democrats were really writing the bill. So that makes me a little circumspect about whether they'd actually go ahead and be able to do it. And another lesson from the Trump years is that, well, Trump is a bit ideologically flexible and might be understating him. But when the sort of competing sides were willing to each basically give everybody else what they wanted, you want something not quite path to citizenship, but you can do something about incorporation, something on border security, on undocumented. But then when it looked like Trump was willing to kind of push everybody toward that, the conservatives in the Senate said, no, we need to do something on legal immigration and cut back legal immigration, and that blows up the deal. And of course, alignments in the House Republicans, right? Very different, often set of concerns than the Senate on immigration. So I don't think the prospects are great. It's just hard, it's hard to know whether there's really an incentive and whether both parties are willing to go to the bargaining table in a way, or will they just say to themselves, the cost of saying no to bargaining, my party might reward me for not going to the table, in which case all bets are off.
Well, that's going to be the last word for now. We're going to have a reception around the corner, so feel free to join us and continue the conversation. Let me give appropriate thanks to the CCAS team who helped put this together. Many of you are here and you know who you are. I hate to start naming names because I'll skip somebody. So thank you. Thank the panelists for spending this time with us, and thank you for joining us. Our third and final installment in this series will be in 2 weeks on October 29th, when, with the election just the next week, we will touch on sort of horse race issues, turnout, and all the many issues that we haven't talked about yet in this series. So thank you for coming.